reintegration, disintegration, what the future holds for this eastern region of Ukraine that is wrecked by armed conflict for now more than in the 7th year. With me today to discuss Donbas, we have two excellent scholars who are not new to Ukraine, who are really watching Ukraine very closely. One is Paul Danieri, a professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, Riverside. His most recent book is called Ukraine and Russia, From Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War, has just been published by the Cambridge University Press. Most importantly, we go quite well way back with Paul when he was a visiting professor at Lviv State University and I was a student of international affairs. So it's a pleasure to reconnect back with Paul and have his views presented here at Chatham House. And we also have Dr. Vlad Mikhnenko, who is an economic geographer and is originally from Donetsk, is currently working on the other place, which is a project at the University of Oxford. Vlad is associate professor in sustainable urban development and fellow of St. Peter's College at the University of Oxford. He's been recently part of the large project that was funded by UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, and his article called Causes and Consequences of the War in Eastern Ukraine and Economic Geography Perspective was published recently in the Asia and Europe-Asia Studies. And we have a surprise commentator also, which I will not be announcing at this moment, but we'll ask him to join in. Almost a year ago, when President Zelenskyy was elected, he promised to end the war. And most recently in his documentary, he also said that I am sure that we will put an end to this war during my presidential term and change tactics if necessary to achieve the end. So what is the manifestation of this conflict at present? As I said, it's now in the 7th year. Only in 2020, we have 47 members of Ukrainian armed forces died, bringing the total number of over 4,000. So there's no ceasefire on the ground. There was an exchange of prisoners most recently for Easter. 20 Ukrainians were able to return and stop being prisoners of war. But we also have a daily reporting of shelling and including COVID spread in the armed forces and additional suffering to citizens that live in the occupied Donbas because of the closures of the crossing points with Ukraine. Overall, you know, Ukrainians believe that Zelenskyy, especially in the Donbas that is controlled by Kiev, they do believe that Zelenskyy could achieve peace and he is really trying hard. And now I would like to turn to our speakers. Paul, could you please kick us off by, you know, bringing us to the current situation, but also explaining the background and what was the evolution of bilateral relations between Ukraine and Russia, and what does this mean for the future of this conflict? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Good morning, everybody from sunny California. I know it's lots of different times of day where you all are, but thanks to Chatham House and to Orysia and Anna for organizing this event. I'm very pleased to be here. So the long term, the thrust of the book that I've just recently finished writing is that the roots of this conflict are quite deep. And in fact, I trace the roots of the conflict all the way back to the foundation of the Ukrainian state in 1991. Russia was never keen on that to begin with. And in the book, I detail through the 90s and then through the aughts and really well prior to 2014, the notion that Russia didn't accept an independent Ukraine, was trying various tactics to try to bring Ukraine back into the Russian fold, and that was then exacerbated by various other factors. What I want to do now is look forward, but that's important background in the sense that I think the causes of this conflict are very deeply seated. And so I think that's something we need to recognize, that it's not a superficial conflict and therefore it's not going to be solved easily. The rhetorical question in the title of today's panel is disintegration or reintegration, to which my response is neither in the foreseeable future, but rather continued stalemate. Stalemate is probably the least exciting prediction, so I apologize for that. But I'll try to explain why I make it and where I do see some possibility for change. There are two recent changes that people have pointed to, maybe some others, to get to the idea that maybe change is afoot. On the Russian side, we've seen Vladislav Sorkis replaced with Dmitry Kozak, and there was a lot of speculation at that time that this was signaling a change in Russian policy. Anders Haslund wrote a very nice piece about this, at least raising the idea that this was going to represent a change in strategy on Russia's part, and maybe a more conciliatory strategy, an effort to solve the conflict. And a couple of American diplomats recently also opined that they thought that Putin was beginning to look for a solution, a way out. On the Ukrainian side, there's been this recent agreement by the part of the administration to negotiate directly with representatives of the DNR and the LNR. This is very controversial, of course. There were protests, and they've sort of used coronavirus or COVID-19 to kind of walk back from this. But there's again an idea that there's room for maneuver. So the question I want to ask is whether these changes mean that the two sides are now inching towards some solution. And I'm not so optimistic. I think as bad as the status quo is, the two sides still differ dramatically on what alternatives to the status quo they think would be acceptable. If I were an economist, I guess I should leave this to Vlad, but I would say the current solution, as bad as it is Pareto optimal. If I were a game theorist, I would say this is a Nash equilibrium. But essentially, I don't think there's too many places to go that won't leave one side dramatically worse off, and that therefore they will block if they can. So basically then what I'll talk about in a few minutes is why, first, whether Minsk can be implemented, and then what the alternatives might be. So can the Minsk agreement be implemented? And I think the answer is probably not. And I think it's worthwhile recalling the context in which it was signed in the first place. Both the first one and the second one, basically the Ukrainians signed at gunpoint, literally. Their troops were being routed in the field. They needed to do whatever they could to get Russia to stop the rout. And so they signed the first agreement in 2014, and then the second one in February 2015. So this was not an agreement that they wanted to sign, that they agreed with. They simply were forced to do it. And so it's not an agreement that Ukraine has an interest in pursuing. In particular, implementing the agreement runs into very quickly this question about conducting free elections under Russian control in Donbas. And that can't happen. And I can talk in detail if you want later about why that can't happen, but Russia doesn't run fair elections anywhere. But more to the point, running free elections would require an external force taking significant control over those territories. It can't happen. So you could pretend to implement Minsk. And the way to pretend to implement Minsk would be to hold the elections and plug your nose and say that they were fair, even if they weren't. I don't think there's any reason why Ukraine would want to agree with that. There's nothing in it, I don't think, for Ukraine. But we'll see. Implementing the Minsk agreements essentially means reintegrating the Donbas on Russia's terms, because as I said, it's basically an agreement that was written to Russia's satisfaction at the very beginning. So in that sense, Ukraine is probably better off with the status quo than it is with Minsk. It's probably even better off with Russia annexing the territories than it is with reintegrating them on Russian terms, which would create all kinds of problems for the Ukrainian state. So instead, Ukraine has implicitly adopted what Colin Powell called the pottery barn rule, which is you break it, you own it. Ukraine has tried to distance itself from any responsibility for the territories and say, okay, Russia, it's your problem. And I don't think anybody in Kiev wants to say this publicly yet, but there is this sort of idea that says, you know what, we're better off without those territories than we are with them back in on any terms except that those that suit us the most, which is pre-2014 status quo. So if the Minsk agreement can't really be implemented, can it be superseded? Could we at some point set it aside, say it's not working, let's move on to something else? And again, I just don't see this happening. Russia has very little reason to move on, to move on from the Minsk agreements because it is so beneficial to Russia. Ukraine has signed off on it. The EU powers support it. So it has a great deal of legitimacy despite its somewhat, I would say, illegitimate origins. So there's no reason for Russia to countenance a move on from the Minsk agreement. So for the stalemate to be broken, someone has to change their position. What would cause them to do that? What would cause Russia to maybe say, okay, it is time to move on from Minsk, or to allow free and fair elections with external supervision in Donbas? Well, one strategy might be, one reason might be to cut costs. If to the extent that the economic and political costs internally in Russia begin to take a toll. Another might be, and I think this is probably more likely, more reasonable, to get the EU to remove sanctions. More strategically, at some point, Russia may come to realize that if the goal is to regain control over all of Ukraine, rather than just the Donbas, this strategy is failing. And Lawrence Friedman has pointed this out in his very good book on the topic. The occupation of Donbas is a major obstacle to Russia's broader goals, what I believe, although we don't know, are Russia's broader goals of controlling Ukraine. And there are other means that Russia has that actually work better and are working better. And actually, I think, and I'm just trying to finish a paper on this, some of those other tactics are going along quite well for Russia. So essentially, Russia wants to get these voters in Donbas, in occupied Donbas, back into the mix in Ukrainian elections. We saw in this most recent parliamentary election, the union of Viktor Medvedchuk with the remnants of the Party of Regions in Donbas. And it seems to me that's really where Russia is betting for the future. For that force to really become a powerful force in Ukrainian politics, they need to get those Donbas voters, or the voters in occupied Donbas, back into the Ukrainian electorate. Moving along, why would Ukraine make concessions? Well, there's actually probably more likelihood. Zelenskyy wants a political victory. He seems pretty flexible. Ukraine may come to be very needy of economic aid, especially if the International Monetary Fund finally throws its hands up. And there may be pressure from the European Union, which has its own reasons to want to end the conflict on Russian terms. More to the point, 4 or 5 years from now, when Nord Stream is finally online, Nord Stream 2 is finally online, and the current gas transit contract expires, Russia will be in a position to really put the screws on Ukraine in terms of gas in a way that it never has been before. So there may be more reason in the medium term for Ukraine to make concessions. The question I would ask, a more incremental question, is could we at least get to a ceasefire? People don't like the term frozen conflict, but a Cold War is better than a hot war. And a frozen conflict is in many respects better than an unfrozen conflict, or a war of attrition, which is really what we have now. That, I think, should probably be the objective in the short to medium term. There are problems with that. The level of casualties we have now is a means of Russia to put pressure on Ukraine, and it's a way for the Ukrainian government to engage in what we call costly signaling, which is by enduring these costs, it shows both Russia and its own people that its commitment is serious. So moving to policy and to potential reasons for hope. Russia is playing the long game. And I think for Ukraine and the West to have any chance of getting to an acceptable outcome, they will have to be able to play a long game as well. That contradicts this sense of urgency that everybody has to end the killing and to move Europe as a whole past this conflict between the West and Russia. So there's real tension, I think, in Western policy at this point. Is there reason for hope? Yes. There is some reason to hope, I wouldn't exaggerate it, that Russia will want to de-escalate and will begin to do so. And I think the crucial thing that I've been watching and will continue to watch is there a decrease and hopefully eventually a cessation of violence along the contact line. A ceasefire, a halt in casualties that could be sustained for a few months might really then get us in a position where we could have enough confidence to think about further steps. So that's to the extent that I can be hopeful, and I'm not. But that's where I would see it, is try to get the killing stopped in the short to medium term. So thanks, and with that, I'll turn it over to Vlad and then look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you, Paul. I think it's an interesting point that you made about whether indeed Russia would see other tools of controlling Ukraine rather than sustaining this simmering conflict in the Donbas. And in a way, we were looking at Chatham House at how conflict impacts the rest of Ukraine's body of politics. And it's quite an effective tool in a way to undermine Ukraine's social cohesion, but also to bleed Ukraine slowly into some of these concessions that Russia wants to make. But I'm sure people will pick up some of those points in the Q&A session. So now I would like to turn to Vlad. Vlad has prepared a couple of slides for us, so he'll share them with us while he is preparing and putting them on the screen. I think his research is very interesting because it looks at the foundations of economic integration of Donbas before the conflict and what happened to this economic fabric between the occupied Donbas, parts of Donbas under Kiev control, under Kiev, and the rest of Ukraine's economy. So Vlad, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arisa, and thank you, Paul, for the brilliant introductory talk. As Arisa has mentioned, we are in the 7th year now of this conflict, and it all began in a hot kind of stage in about April of 2014. During this period, the war was very hot. If you remember, there have been a lot of heavy armaments used, infantry, air force, heavy artillery, tanks, and the battlefield has been mostly around central Donbas. And since August 2014, when the Russian troops began full infiltration and invasion of these territories, we've established 456 kilometers of front line, which has been gradually stabilized. Although you can see from this map from the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, of effectively the last map I've just got yesterday, you still have skirmishes around the front line even today. The conflict has, in a very conservative estimate by the UN, has consumed about at least 13,000 lives and about 31,000 people were injured, although it's a very conservative estimate, I must say. And it's produced a lot of obviously hardship and a lot of pain. I've been trying to understand the internal dynamics of the war itself, and especially trying to understand whether the claims that were propagated in the early 2014, in the beginning of the conflict, especially by the Kremlin about the civil nature of the conflict, civil war, whether those claims have had any particular background in reality. I would like just to highlight a special issue that's been published in a European study this month on war and displacement in Ukraine, and the paper which is there in open access. So if anyone, obviously today, I won't be able to go through all of it, but if anyone is interested, please have a look at its access, and more details are there than I will be able to talk today. However, I have updated a lot of information, so you won't feel that I'm repeating myself. So just to start this little introduction, I'd like to remind people that the situation in the Donbas pre-war in 2013, in the kind of common parlance, most people focus on, obviously, on Donetsk, has been the largest city and it's been the most affluent city in the region. However, I'd like to remind everyone that the Donbas consists historically of at least 2 provinces, 2 oblasts, Luhansk and Donetsk, in which the main preoccupation of the population since 1869 at least has been coal mining, and the dark shaded part of the map is the Donetsk coal field. And of course, most of the cities are connected to the coal field itself. At the beginning of the conflict, it was a large region overall, over 6.5 million people. It produced about $28 billion of output a year, although territorially both of the provinces are the same territory. Donetsk Oblast has always been more developed, and it produced the bulk of the output. Donetsk Oblast also produced the bulk of the income as well, although overall the Donbas was a lower middle income region of only $4,181 per capita of annual income. So it was not some sort of affluent, rich Dubai kind of Ukraine. It was a low-income region in which industry was still prevalent. 40% of the local economy was based on heavy industry. In terms of the kind of fiscal status of Ukraine and fiscal status of the region itself, and this is important to highlight, is that at the beginning of the war, by the end of 2013, it was an average Ukrainian region in terms of its population share versus its regional GDP. So the region produced exactly the same amount as it should have produced on average. Population of the Donbas was 14.5% of Ukraine, and its regional GDP was exactly the same, 14.4% of Ukraine. So it was not a dynamo driving the economic growth in the country. It was an average region. What is important to highlight as well is that it was an aging region, shrinking region in terms of population, and also that the pensioners, the old age pensioners, and also early retired pensioners, coal miners, constituted an overwhelming part of the population. 15.7% of Ukrainians pensioners lived in Donetsk, in the Donbas itself, and 18% of its GDP has been spent on pensions overall. And if you consider the pension bill of the Donbas at the beginning of the war, of 20% of GDP, it was more than twice higher than an average Western economy could have afforded. So that's, I think, is an important point to make. Just a little comparison between different other regions of Ukraine. If you look at this fairly complicated graph, you see two lines. The horizontal line divides regions which are richer than Ukrainian average. So the regions above the line were the regions that were richer than the Ukrainian average back in 2013. And the regions below it were the poorer regions. And the horizontal line and the vertical line is between regions that were growing faster than Ukraine and regions that were growing slower. So you can see quite a few of poor but catching up regions. They were growing fast. They were catching up with the average. Lvivsk, Kirovogradsk, Sevastopol as well. They were doing quite well before the war. You had three very large, economically large, rich, and also growing very fast regions of the city of Kiev and the Kiev province, but also Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, the Dnipropetrovsk province. Those three were rich and also surging ahead. On this upper left quadrant, you have regions which are rich and richer than the average, but they were growing slower than Ukraine, so they were not driving the growth. They were losing ground, as I call it, and Donetsk here amongst Kievska and amongst Kharkivska, Poltavska provinces. Luhansk was here, it was a poorer than average region and also slow growing. So Luhansk was gradually falling behind of Ukrainian growth trajectories. Donetsk was losing ground. So that's important to understand what was their position before the war. Of course, the devastation has been quite tremendous. The gross domestic product, the local economy collapsed effectively during the war, especially 14 and 15. And then from about 15, when the Minsk agreements were started to be, at least the truce has been implemented gradually, you can see gradual decline of both provinces. And Donetsk stabilized at about 38% of the pre-war average, and Luhansk stabilized about 28% of the pre-war average. So you can see a massive drop and then stagnation in both parts of the region. In terms of losing the income and in terms of income inequalities, you can see that retail sales, which are a good measurement of people purchasing power, they also dropped to 26% Donetsk, 16.3% Luhansk provinces. If we combine the sales of consumer goods on both parts, government control areas and non-government control areas, then the whole of the Donbas is probably around 40% in terms of pre-war sales. So the impact of the war on the role of the Donbas itself has been quite significant. So before the war, it was a very large, economically important, shrinking, lower middle income, old industrial regions. It was losing ground economically. It was falling behind demographically, losing population as well, but it was still a 14.4% of the Ukrainian economy. And in comparative terms, 14.4, 14.5% is what California stands for US. So it was an important chunk of Ukrainian economy. In the UK terms, take Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and a good chunk of northeast of England, that will be that figure. So it was an important region. During the war, and the consequences of it, it dropped. Its role has shrunk to almost, to 6%. Donetsk province shrunk to 5%, and Luhansk shrunk to just 1%. So it lost about 50% of its output, 61% in hryvnia terms, 71% in dollar terms. So it's been a dramatic economic output loss of 19 to 20 billion dollars. Now, of course, the front line has effectively partitioned the Donbas, and before the war, what is currently non-government control areas were the areas in which a lot of output was produced. Donetsk, Makiivka, Horlivka, and Luhansk were 4 out of 5 biggest cities in the Donbas. They were all now in non-government control areas. They used to produce 47% of the whole output of the region. Now, and it took me quite a lot of time to try to get to the bottom of this, given that the statistics are very unreliable coming from the other side. But overall today, you can think that 80% of the whole Donbas output is on the government control area, and only 20% is on the non-government control area. In Luhansk Oblast, the situation is quite similar as well. What is important to highlight is that there's been quite a dramatic decline in income and poverty and impoverishment, especially on the non-government control areas. If you take today's monthly wages on the Ukrainian side of the front line, in Donetsk Oblast, say it's 13,177 hryvnia. On the non-government control side, if you calculate it in Ukrainian currency, it will be below 5,000 hryvnia. So the earnings trajectories have departed. Before Donetsk was the richest place, it was the richest city in the region. Now, if you live in the government control areas, your income have actually increased from about $160 a month as an average monthly wage to $558 now, the December 2019 figures for the Donetsk province. Whereas in the non-government control areas of the Donetsk province, your salaries dropped to $183 per month. In Luhansk, the situation is fairly similar. Before the war, an average employee in Luhansk province was earning $412 a month. Now, sort of the wages almost recovered to $394, whereas in non-government control areas, they're stuck about 140. So you can see effectively almost 3 times gap in earning power. So I think that is an important thing to remember. If you look at the growing commentary from the non-government control areas, especially from the former warlords, the people who are very enthusiastic in joining up the armed resistance, the armed struggle, and joining with the Russian volunteers and the army, including Mr. Khodorkovsky, who was one of the warlords in the region. Later on, he was kicked out from the leadership of the area. He has been the most vocal critique of the current regime, saying that deindustrialization and effectively social degradation is taking hold. And he was claiming back in 2017 that the region is going to turn into some kind of new Abkhazia or Southern Ossetia. Will be herding goats and sheep, and that will be all. That's you might argue, I thought it was quite a dramatic representation, but then the local, some of my informants from the Donetsk sent me a picture of this little advertising stand in which you see people advertising for Ukrainian pensions, and also an advert for disabled people with amputated lower limb to go to Russia and effectively work in begging. So that's one of the adverts that is central in here. 2 years from Khodorkovsky's warning, Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is a Russian right-wing tabloid, chauvinist tabloid, has published a very intriguing expose of Donetsk and Luhansk guest workers on Abkhazian plantations of mandarin oranges, in which people are working there for a night stay and a bottle of lager as a payment for a day of hard work. And they claim, according to the interview, and you can watch it, also the videos, they claim that at home they can only earn 5,000 rubles a month. So the situation has been deteriorating drastically on the non-government control areas. At the same time, this probably what holds almost 1.5 million Ukrainians inside of Ukraine who are officially registered as internally displaced people. And you can see the figures which peaked in June 2016. They remain fairly, I mean, they're dropping a little bit, especially during the verification campaigns by Ukrainian government trying to cut pensions for people who either are deceased or cannot claim to be living in Ukraine. But overall, even today, 1.5 million people are still internally displaced in Ukraine. And given the situation and given the prospects on non-government control areas, obviously you could guess that those 1.5 million will stay on where you are. However, of course, the situation for them in terms of housing and jobs is very difficult. So the question, I think, picking up from Paul's comments, what are the solutions and what can we envisage? The question we can pose when, if the bridges are rebuilt and if that Russian tank is taken away from the other side, whether people will return to the non-government control areas, so by that time to the Ukraine proper, and what will await them there is a big massive question. And hopefully we'll discuss that later today. So I'll stop now and wait for the speaker to return.
Thank you, Vlad. Thank you very much for giving us this economic perspective on the region and the really a cost of this war in terms of economy and destruction and suffering that lots of Ukrainians who had to both remain and to leave had to take and are still in a way of evolving situation with COVID. The public funds are being channeled elsewhere, the crossings are being closed, and the humanitarian needs of this aging population pretty much that had so much of its income dropped remains in the question. And President Zelenskyy, of course, was talking about reintegration of Donbas. A lot of Ukrainians wanted to hear also safe reintegration. And I would like to bring in one of our commentators today who is with us here is the ex-Minister of Defense, Andriy Zagorodnyuk. Andriy, are you here with us? Can you please join us with video?
Yes,
and Andriy has been leading the Ministry of Defense with the Honcharuk's half government, but he's been for quite some time leading on the defense sector reform, previously after the Euromaidan, leading the Reform Project Office, also spoke at Chatham House, I believe it was 2017, on impressive reform within the Ministry of Defense. So thank you, Andriy, for joining us. We would like to hear your reflections on what you've heard and anything you would like to add at this point. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is obviously extremely complex subject. There is no simple solution. There is massive issues related to any solution, and basically there is no perfect answer to this whole problem at the moment. I mean, that's for sure. So what we can say from our perspective when we were developing our strategy is that indeed people are tired with the war. And there is a massive a demand for the peace in the region generally from the civilian population. People in non-controlled territories, as we call them, or temporary occupied territories, actually, as we call them, TOT, are really, I mean, they're really disillusioned with with what some of them have expected, in 2014. Lots of them were scared of some kind of a fascist or sort of aggressive to Russian-speaking population government, which was supposed to come after Maidan. We have seen with a great surprise that some of these beliefs were actually like really believed by, really like trusted by even sort of educated people with the high education, with some kind of a knowledge about the things. They indeed thought that you know, of all different kinds of fakes and all sort of propaganda kind of messages which were sent around in the region, and indeed many of them were scared of like physically for their safety and so on. After that, there was all this nightmare of 2014, 2015, 16 war, and as of now, a lot of people are, you know, clearly dissatisfied with what we've seen, like when the experience of living actually in those territories. However, there is obviously not much they can do at the moment, except for leaving, and as we have seen, the numbers were like staggering. The price we opened, I was myself engaged in lots of interesting sort of like defining initiatives at the time. For example, the disengagement and the building of the bridge to Stanitsa Luganska. So I can say, for example, I've been on this bridge several times, and they have about 20,000 people a day crossing, and which the numbers are like quite staggering as well. The food is 3 times more expensive on the temporary occupied territories than they are in the government-controlled areas. So some people are just going for food, and also the other people are going for food, picking up the food and then bringing them back to the TOT and then basically selling them to the stores, and that's how they're surviving. So I'm definitely supporting the ideas of the what we call the humanitarian disengagement, which would open the checkpoints and crossings, because that opens up to the people understanding that, first of all, the government-controlled territories are normal. There is no fascists running around with the machine guns shooting people. You know, this is a fake, and this always been a fake. And secondly, it's the fact that they can somehow survive, and somehow what we call the social sort of reconnection can actually start. Reintegration and reconciliation can actually start, and we all understand this is a long-term story, and there is no short and quick solution there. Regarding the very quick reintegration campaigns, I think that everybody now in the government, at least like vast majority of the experts who I have a privilege of dealing with, both civilian, military, and so on, they all realize that the quick and haphazard reintegration can only intoxicate the rest of Ukraine, and then it will not mean the peace, it will actually mean the worsening of the conflict, and it actually may mean something quite terrible. Because indeed, when we're talking about any reconciliation and any reintegration, it needs to be very well thought through. It needs to be very well calculated, and it needs to be like steps by step somehow arranged. But certainly, just opening up borders, certainly just making an election like tomorrow, for example, or bringing any sort of quick solutions, they can end up with some disasters. And for instance, the elections, obviously, you know, is a product of democracy. There is no democracy there, so bringing elections, it has nothing to do with democracy. It's just will be legitimizing the gangsters which are currently in the power, and that's pretty much it. So that's why there was a lot of tension in the society in Ukraine about the actual dates of elections, because when we're talking about the date, it means something needs to happen. Let's say in October, for example, there was a discussion of October, and how we can establish some sort of a democratic culture in those territories like by October. I mean, it was slightly unrealistic. That's why there was like a decent amount of tension. However, important thing is that under no circumstances we can agree on the stalemate situation or on the frozen conflict situation and so on. I understand and I agree with Paul when he was saying that it might be better than some other options. And truly, though I was receiving, as a Minister of Defense, I was receiving texts every morning with the people who lost and the people who we got wounded and killed every other day, or actually, sorry, every hour I was receiving a text. So it's not like it's not a good solution, because indeed it's not a frozen conflict at the moment. It's people die every second day. We've been losing about at my tenure, it was like 10 people a week sometimes. So like something like that, and which is some wounded, some killed, and always it's a tragedy in the family, always it's a tragedy in the drama, you know. So we cannot say, okay, we're happy with this, with the things as they are, because you can't be happy if you're a responsible member of the government. That's one thing. Second thing is that as soon as we say, all right, let it just keep it that way, immediately Russia will come up with two narratives. The first narrative would be, okay, so they're happy with the situation. They're okay to stop it like this. So we're no longer an aggressor. We're actually an ensurer of peace in the very troubled area called Donbas, you know. So we're actually making sure that there is peace there. So take sanctions away, like straight away. You know, they would be immediately using that in order to put, well, they are actually, but they would give them a pretty significant card, and which they were using already during a Poroshenko's government, like a latest years, were coming up with this, like saying, you see, Poroshenko is okay about this. He's pretty enjoying his role of being a sort of commander-in-chief, you know, making pictures with soldiers and tanks and so on and so on. So he's actually okay. He's fine. So he doesn't want a resolution. So how you can call us an aggressor in this case? And they used it a lot, and I spoke to a lot of international diplomats and Minister of Defense of actually all NATO countries, and a lot of them were actually kind of not sure, you know, about that. I don't want to name the countries, obviously, but you probably can guess. Some countries were like a little bit hesitant of calling Russia an aggressor, and actually in the private conversations they were, but not publicly. So that's a massive threat. And the other massive threat of recognizing the frozen conflict as something we'd be okay with is that they will immediately say, okay, that's done, Donbas done, what's next? Is it Moldova? Is this Zakarpattia, Transcarpathia? Is it like where we are next? Odessa, you know, Mariupol. So what is the next chunk which we can bite? Because there is no point for Russia to just keep the Donbas. You know, it was never a plan. What was the plan? And we fairly know what the plan already, you know, because we got some papers, you know, and we got some statements from various people. And the plan was that they would bring these kind of a revolutionary sort of riots to various locations, including Kharkiv, including Dnipro, including Odessa, obviously, and including some other southern or eastern areas, and the country would just collapse. I mean, if we had the same situation as we had in Donetsk and Lugansk in few other cities, especially like over 1 million population, that's it. Ukraine would not survive as a country by now. I mean, it would not pass the new year 14 to 15. Because imagine loans are not returned, you know, money lost in the banks, payments, you know, all the economy would just not survive. I mean, the country would not exist. So that was actually the plan. And then you just pick up pieces and do whatever. And then you come in as a peacekeeper, you know, and then you help. So that was the plan. And that didn't work out. And so it only worked out in a parts of the regions for Lugansk and Donetsk area. And after that, they were sitting and saying, all right, so now what we can do? Now what we're going to do is this. So all this story about Donbas, Novorossiya, DNR, LNR, so-called, all these kind of territories, like sort of governments, they all came up very quickly by the end of 2014, when they were suddenly coming up with a subjectivity of the some sort of state sovereignty and so on. So, I mean, they started that conflict without that plan originally.
Okay.
So,
Andrei, I'm sorry
yeah,
to interrupt you.
So now the thing is, yeah, just to conclude.
Yeah,
conclude. Yeah, obviously I can talk for like,
because I have lots of
days,
questions in chat, and I'm sure we'll come back to the speakers. I have a lot of interest from the audience, and I want to make sure.
Yeah, anyway, so what we need to understand this is extremely, we cannot promise peace because it's peace, you can either win or you can lose. I mean, you can either win, you can lose, or you can negotiate. So if we're talking about negotiation, you can't promise the outcome of the negotiation. However, what we can do is we can say that we can promise that we can stay on that track. We have to project the need for the peace over and over again in all platforms available all the time. We have to be initiator of the peace discussions. We have always to be and we always should be pressing. And now oil is cheap. Now Russia is in trouble, financial trouble. We should use all possible means of reaching our goal. And then obviously hope can be part of your strategy, but we should hope that something else happens, you know, with Russia, what worsens this negotiating position. But we should press and press and press until they realize that, you know, keeping it as it is worse than actually giving back, and somehow to start this very long and tough process. I think that's the only way out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that that was important actually to pinpoint why the frozen conflict is not an option Ukraine is wishing for, and how it can even further undermine integrity of Ukraine. But now I would like to turn into the audience, and I have quite a lot of questions in the chat. If you can also see them if you click on participants, you would see the kind of questions that are arising in your minds. You could also use the raise hand function in your Zoom meeting. I don't see any hands so far, but I will go to the chat, and I will try to be directing questions, because we have you know 40 or 45 minutes or so, and I would like to get as many answers as possible. So perhaps this one we would go to Paul from Ostap Kryvdik at the Ukrainian Catholic University Analytical Center. Do you think Russia's aggression against Ukraine and Donbas can be resolved separately of the wider picture, ignoring all those Russians' other cohesive regional actions in Transnistria, Crimea, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia? Paul, would you be able to answer this one?
Sure, and I'll try to be brief. It's a very good question, and I've debated with some of my colleagues. Is the conflict in Eastern Ukraine so much a part of broader issues, really stretching in the whole European, Eurasian landmass, that only an overarching architectural solution can solve the problem? I think in some sense the answer is yes, but I think in the real world, so to speak, these overarching solutions where we solve everything and therefore solve the small things, I don't think they actually work very often. For Russia, the US, the EU, NATO, the other countries of the region to agree on some kind of new rules of the road for the continent is going to be very, very difficult. There have been some proposals recently about this, one from Rand, one that was made in Munich that raised a lot of controversy. That's a very difficult thing to do. And so I think that in practice, the solutions are going to more likely be incremental, piecemeal, from below. It's certainly true that there's a lot of connection between what's happening in Eastern Ukraine, Abkhazia, Transnistria, but I don't think it's very easy to solve them all at once.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And this one would be for Vlad from my colleague James Nixie, who says, we often talk about Donetsk and Luhansk as though they're almost exactly the same, yet Vlad's presentation showed that this was not so economically before 2014. Do these differences between them have implications for an eventual reintegration solution? Vlad, over to you.
Yes, absolutely. I think I could be biased given that I am from Donetsk originally, but I think most of the people in Ukraine who talk about and worry about reintegration and want reintegration, in their minds is the return of the city of Donetsk to the Ukrainian control. I think the city of Donetsk seems to be the jewel in the crown of the region, and that's where most of the assets are. That's where most of the people sort of beliefs are connected to that city itself. It has still some assets remaining there. Luhansk, of course, and Luhansk Oblast, the non-government control areas of Luhansk region are much more heavy industrialized. They are much more dependent on coal mining. They are now drastically closing down, abandoning, to be precise, abandoning coal mines, which have never been very profitable since 1975, really. And therefore, deindustrialization in Luhansk part of the region has been progressing even faster than in Donetsk part of the non-government control areas. So the Luhansk part is, of course, will be a much heavier burden to pick up and to either rebuild or stabilize than even Donetsk. But I think, I don't know whether Andrei will agree with me, most people, when they talk about the Donbas reintegration, the city of Donetsk itself is that kind of place where people's dreams are located.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vlad. I think it also kind of covers Jade McGlynn question, who was asking in the chat whether, you know, one region could be easier for integrate than the other. And that answers the question. But I would like to direct one question for Andrei in terms of leverage. And Richard Wright is saying to get movement, there has to be some kind of leverage. Where is that leverage? If you were to look at, you know, Ukraine or Ukraine with its Western allies, where does the leverage come, and what will prompt Putin to make, you know, to change his game in Ukraine? Andrei, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting question, but I would read it till the end, because it says like, why, if Russia is playing a long game, why Russia should ease the pressure? I think that first of all, we also should be playing a long game, and there's lots of people here who already like focus, understanding that this is a long game, and they're ready for the long game. So it's obviously for politicians it's a problem because they elected for 5 years, you know, and that's immediately brings. But whoever is not politician, you know, many of us thinking that we have to be prepared. So time is not working for Russia. Time is not helping Russia, because they are losing probably tens of billions per year on sanctions. They are losing billions by supporting. We calculated it was about 2-3 billion a year to support so-called DNR, LNR with salaries and so on. The heavy industry, which is there, is not innovative like at all. There is no innovation. There is no investment. There is no. So basically, they're just using the resources which are there, and that's it. And also there is a massive, I don't know if you're aware, but there is a massive environmental crisis coming up, unfortunately, which we have to come to decide what we're going to do about that. But the mines which have been produced there, the coal mines, they are flooded now, and this flood is like is poisoning the groundwaters in the area, because they stopped using those mines, and they're like full of water now, and this methane, it gets to the groundwater. So basically it's it will end up with some, it's already ending up with some severe environmental issues. So to support all that, Putin needs lots of money. And there is an opinion, which is obviously debatable because the economy of Russia is not transparent, but there is an opinion that economy of Russia is not doing well at all, as they try to portray. And Russians lie like pretty much all the time, as we know. This is like what they do. And so whenever they say something like they don't care about something, that means they care about that quite a bit. So when they say, for example, oh, we don't care about the sanctions, okay, then you know that this is a big issue. Or for something, so like you can just simply like use that for whatever they say often. And it's not actually a joke. I mean, it's actually works. And so we know that sanctions are working. We know because every time they're raising this issue up, including COVID-related discussion of G20, when they ask, like, by the way, let's remove all the sanctions. You know, that's a nice gesture for the world. So we know that's a problem. And if we keep on pressure, that it should at some point of time, we should reach the tipping point when they would be saying, okay, then maybe there is something which where they can back off. They will never recognize that, never ever, but we will see that happening eventually. I'm sure.
Yeah, as long as the facts on the ground change, we'll be happy with it. We'll not take their words for granted. But
No,
I would
don't
like
take
to,
anything for granted.
I would
Yeah.
like to ask to unmute first Ursula Woolley and then Katerina Volchuk from the participant list. If you could please direct your questions to a speaker, that would be much easier. It would be also if you could limit it not to a comment but to a question. Ursula Woolley, could you please unmute yourself and ask a question?
Thank you, Orysia. My question is for Paul, to pick up on something that you touched on during your talk. You talked about the other channels of influence that Russia is pursuing in Ukraine at the moment, and everybody perceives those channels of influence very differently and evaluates them very differently. So it'd be lovely to hear from lots of different people about that. But how do you characterize or conceive of those channels of influence which are gaining momentum in your perception at the moment, and how important they are as a context for what's going on in Donbas? Because I think they're extraordinarily important.
Paul, could you please park that question in your notebook, and we'll go over to Katerina Volchuk, please.
Great, thank you very much. And my first question is probably to Paul. It's great to see you, and it would be a very good opportunity for you to hear about the US position. Obviously, the impeachment debates shed quite a lot of light on what happens inside the administration, but with COVID and everything else, we've lost a bit of sort of insight what's happening, especially with Volkov gone on the conflict, the US approach, and especially with Biden in the game, how does it affect the whole position on the conflict? And my second question is to Vlad again. Nice to see you and to Andriy. A lot of the time has been made about the personality changes, Surkov being replaced by Kozak. And yet when we think about the underlying objectives, as Paul implied, they have not changed. So what about the significance? Does Kozak means a difference or not? Thank you.
Okay, let's start with Paul. Paul?
Yeah, so the other instruments, I'll take that one first, and then I'll talk about the U.S. position. There's a whole range, and I've just been working on a paper on this with my colleague Ihor Horak in Ivano-Frankivsk. But let me just run down some of them very quickly. Gas, right? This has been an issue for a long time, but but Nord Stream 2 is going to be a big issue for Ukraine, and I think it's been appreciated, but it's been deferred a little bit because the pipeline's not complete, and that a most recent gas transit agreement is online. The pressure in the Sea of Azov, right? The Russians built this bridge, and basically they've now turned the Sea of Azov into a Russian lake, which doesn't change the entire world, but puts more pressure on the Ukrainian economy and more potential military pressure on that southern flank of Ukraine. The media, I think this is the thing that everybody's most aware of, the various ways in which Russia influences Ukraine through media. And I just point out that Ukraine responded by sort of cutting access to a lot of the Russian media sources and social media sources, but pro-Russia figures have now been buying up Ukrainian media outlets over the past few years. The elections. I think the most interesting thing going on really over the last year is the alliance of Viktor Medvedchuk with the remnants of the Party of Regions, two historically pro-Russian forces in Ukraine who historically, at least in my reading, were doing their own thing and were separate and distinct. The fact that they're now together, I think is really interesting. And if you want to get a sense of how much stock Russia is putting in Medvedchuk, I would watch this film that Oliver Stone made, this sort of puff piece, why Russia is getting Oliver Stone to make a puff piece about Viktor Medvedchuk. That is just, I think that's telling. So those are just some of the things, but again, there are just lots of, sorry, I'm trying to gesture here with my hands, but you can't see them. Lots of things from different angles, none of which by themselves is going to be decisive, but all narrowing the range of options for Ukraine, putting a little more pressure on, a little more pressure, seeing what happens. Not necessarily a coherent strategy, but just a lot of, I think, opportunistic pressure. The question that Kasia Volchuk asked about the U.S. position. I'm tempted to say, don't ask me about the U.S. position. It's a riddle, wrapped in an enigma and all the rest of it. The U.S. has been distracted not only by COVID, but by its own domestic political ructions. In a way, that's a very bad thing for Ukraine. In a way that it's a good thing for Ukraine, because the professional diplomats, the professional, what people dismissively call the deep state, but let's just call it the civil service in the United States, are doing an excellent job. They're fantastic. And I think you saw this in these impeachment hearings. These are fantastic people working hard, doing great stuff. Left alone, they'll do they'll do the best they can. When the political interference gets in there, it's a little bit tricky. So the lack of attention right now, I actually see as a good thing. As to what we might see as this campaign goes on, we're going to see it come back, because it's going to be one of the tactics that President Trump uses to try to put Biden on the defensive. I think the really interesting question is, where is Joe Biden on Ukraine if he comes to be elected? And I'm not sure that I have a good sense of it yet, except to say that, again, beyond the top of the administration itself, there's been consensus across Republicans and Democrats in the US Congress, of which Biden is one, that's been very supportive of Ukraine.
Yeah, let's go to Vlad and
Sure.
then to Andrei.
Thanks, Marisa. And also connecting to Katarina's question, there was another question: how well are the non-government controlled occupied territories are integrated into the Russian economy as well? I think that's two linked questions. I would like to remind everyone that despite the change in the personnel of the Donbas controller in the Kremlin from Surkov to Dmitry Kozak, from 15th of December 2014, so effectively from the beginning of Minsk I, the Russians have established officially, and it is well publicized, interministerial commission for the help in humanitarian affairs to the southeastern districts of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasti. And that commission has on its membership every deputy minister of every Russian federal ministry, except for the Minister of Defense, of course. And that commission has been chaired by Dmitry Kozak since December 14 as a vice prime minister. It is a hands-on bureaucratic organization that effectively runs the remnants of the Donbas industry from the Kremlin. The headquarters of the commission are in Rostov-on-Don, closer to the action, of course. So Dmitry Kozak has been involved intimately in running or trying to keep some sort of economy going on the occupied territory of the Donbas since the very beginning. And I presume his sort of new status now is in acknowledgement of his professional, bureaucratic, and also trust that he has directly with the president of Russia. And therefore, he's been entrusted to continue with this, running the Donbas economy, presumably cutting some of the most horrible corruption and stealing of Russian funds. Presumably kind of trying to normalize some of the situation. It's important to also point out that the Russians have not integrated the Donbas economy fully, but they run it through South Ossetia, which is recognized by Russia protectorate in the North Caucasus. So the Donbas financial institutions, they're on the occupied territories via all the funds through a Southern Ossetian bank, which is then rewired back to Russia. So the sanctions and the fear of sanctions is clear and present in their minds of the Russian institutions. So they do not directly are not directly involved in running particular companies or firms or steelworks or coal mines. So they run it through various shadowy, semi-shadow organizations registered in South Ossetia in particular.
Yeah, continuing on this, there is a whole financial legal scheme of how to avoid the sanctions for Russians to sort of integrate the economy of the so-called DNR, LNR to, support them and basically buy and sell their products. And yes, that involves Ossetia, and that involves all kind of companies, and that also includes a whole number of Russian companies trying to help sanction Crimea products to reach Europe, for example, and so on. So concerning Kozak, I will just be very simple. Kurt Walker, who you probably know, all of you, have commented on this already, and I fully agree with his comment. He said that during his communication with both Surkov and Kozak, he kind of noticed that none of them actually is making any decisions. So they are basically decisions are made in some other place by some other person. We all know who. It's just the way they may communicate, it might be different. Kozak may be more like a sort of trying to project an image of negotiator, like more like you know, than the other guy. But essentially, we cannot say that if Russian position is going to change, it's going to change because of these individuals change. No, it should be because of something else.
Okay, I have two questions that are related to the impact of COVID-19, one from Tony van der Tag and one from Craig Oliphant. In a way, they're asking whether this could open up some opportunities for more humanitarian assistance and to do some confidence building measures. What kind of access Kyiv has right now to deliver any assistance related to COVID? Maybe Andriy knows it on the ground.
Well, there are like humanitarian funds run by private humanitarian funds. Official Kyiv is not working with with those areas, but it doesn't preclude the private funds to which are registered, which are like, you know, formal, official to help out.
Okay. I would like to bring in Katerina Busol. So Katerina, could you please unmute yourself?
Two questions. The first one for Vlad, please. Vlad, do you have the information about the so-called returning IDPs? Because the Ukrainian government claims that it creates so many favorable conditions for the students to come and to study in continental government-controlled Ukraine, or creates the favorable economic conditions for the academics from Donbas and Crimea to come. But then these people find the reality much harsher and they return to the non-controlled areas and we lose the people. So could you comment on this statistics? And the second question is to Andriy. Andriy, you mentioned the environmental concern in Donbas, and the Ukrainian government is so good at pointing out the issues happening in uncontrolled areas. My question is, cumulatively, with the environmental issues in Chernobyl, with the fires, and with the issues of the Kerch,
yeah, that's a good question,
and the Donbas environmental concern, can we expect the more increased attention to the environmental issues from the current government? Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. Let's go to Vlad and then to Andriy.
Okay, I'll just, I think what we need to understand is that there are several types of IDP movements between the occupied and occupied territories. It's hardly a case for a very small part of people who just left in 2014 and never were able to come back. A lot of people left in 2014 and had a lot of trips forwards and back, either bringing stuff back from their former homes to the new homes in government control areas, or returning back for some time when they were not able to afford housing in Ukraine itself. But however, those people also found themselves in a new situation back in say Donetsk or Makiivka, in which of course their lives has been shattered completely, and what they thought their lives would be, you know, they were still thinking on pre-war terms. When they returned in 2014, 15, 16, when they saw what happened to their flats, to their apartments, and also to the whole situation in the occupied territories, they also decided to return back to Ukraine. Some of them went back to Russia as well. We have on the peak, on that peak in June 16, the Russians and Belarusians claimed to have received 1.5 million of refugees from the Donbas. I've seen some of these people in Moscow. It's very easy to find them. So the region has been now is a strange sort of situation in which people coming in and out continuously, picking up some things, bringing some goods, money, cash, taking cash out. So it's not a stable sort of, you know, migration one point to another. It's a continuous movement around. But the figures of 1.5 million still been officially registered, even despite those obvious attempts. You can see on the map on the figure here, all those attempts to cut bogus claims, as they claim, still continue. Every time the figures of IDPs go up again. You can see every time after every check, they still go back again. So I think it is a very long-term problem, but also the transitioning in and out of the zone is continuous. And therefore we need to think about it in a slightly more sort of dynamic sense, rather than people moving to Ukraine and then returning back and that is it. That's never an end.
Andriy, on environment, could you please address?
Well, obviously, you know, the issue with the fires in the Chernobyl area is bad. I was in Kiev at that time. I've seen how bad it is, but I mean, I wouldn't compare. The society keeps government extremely rough on accountability with the situation. Right now, we're measuring all the quality of the air in Kiev, and currently it's absolutely fine. I have it on my app all the time, and as many other people. So I wouldn't compare really that issue, and that is the long term. This is like a serious, long-term disaster coming up there with the flooded mines. So it's a slightly different scale of things. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The government should be held accountable about the, you know, addressing the fires in the forest. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. I would like to come back to sanctions because we have one of the questions from Maria Shagina directed to Paul. I mean, Western sanctions are one of the leverages to, in a way, change the cost or impose price on this military conflict in the East. And the question is, how realistic is that the EU will ramp up sanctions given its fragile unity? And what is your opinion on the recent suggestions to ease sanctions in exchange of incremental progress, or more recently in exchange of also it being a humanitarian crisis related to COVID? Paul.
Thank you. I think the sanctions are more important, more significant than a lot of people have given them weight for. It's certainly true that the sanctions aren't going to by themselves force Russia to change their policy, but both economically and especially symbolically, they're putting a price on Russia that Russia really does not want to bear. And Andriy, I think, sort of made reference to this, right? When the Russians say they don't care about sanctions, that's a good sign that they do. So this is a high priority for Russia, which gives the EU and the West leverage. The problem at this point is unity among the EU. And I don't think there is enough unity within the EU to extend or to ramp up the sanctions. I just don't see it happening. There's too many governments in the EU that have very different ideas. I think that the more interesting question is whether the EU will continue to maintain the sanctions. And the way the sanctions are designed, there's a little bit of stickiness in undoing them. But I think that's actually a major diplomatic issue for the next few years, is will the EU maintain the sanctions? The Russians are using a lot of means at their disposal to try to cajole various governments to undo those things. And actually this, to get back to a question that Kostya Volchuk asked, this is, I think, where the United States can play a really important role, to the extent that it can reestablish itself as some kind of leader. Lifting the sanctions in terms, in return for some kind of concessions. This gets very tricky because it's very easy. It's once a sanction is removed, it will be almost impossible to get it reinstated. And yet whatever concession Russia makes in return for that can be undone like that. And so that's kind of the game that Russia is quite logically going to play. And that's the dilemma, and I might say the political trick for Ukraine and for its backers in the West, is, to put it simply, not to fall for that. Yeah, I'll leave it there. There's a lot more to be said about that.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I mean, this conflict clearly has a military dimension, and benefiting from Andriy being here, I don't know how much you can share with us here since it's being on the record. Just to remind everybody that it's being on the record. I have a question from Domitila Sagramosa, who is asking, what is the military objectives of Kyiv in Donbas? Simply to hold the ceasefire line, or is it also planning to try to restore control over some of the areas of the such as Donetsk airport or other objects?
That's a very simple answer. I mean, yes, at the moment our position is to keep the line as where it is. There is no point of trying to regain the Donbas airport. I mean, there's honestly nothing left, and it doesn't have and we won't be able to explain any losses during that operation to anybody, either in the country or outside, where we'll have to answer the question, why do not we hold Minsk agreement? And so basically, at the moment there is no plan. However, obviously we keep on training. We keep on increasing the capabilities, training for all kinds of different scenarios, because it's you have to be ready for all different scenarios.
And perhaps as a follow-up, with these 3 disengaged areas that took place since before the Normandy summit in Paris and one after, from what I remember, are there any violations on the side of the Russian-backed troops to try to take back territory because of that, or not? Or
No, there hasn't been any in those specific areas. So all of them were done before the Normandy summit. So these were Stanitsa, Luhanska, Petrivsky and Zolote in 3 locations, and no, there was a very serious shooting back in February in close to one of these locations, and there were shootings in those locations, but there weren't any attempts of actually to advance or any of that. So basically, humanitarian disengagement, it kind of works. So basically we didn't lose any specific strategic or tactical advantages, or didn't get to any disadvantaged position. But every location is very extremely different. Topography is extremely diverse there, so every kilometer is a whole different story. So talking about some locations is not talking about some other locations.
Well, we're jumping here between the military and economy, but it's, this conflict impacts everything, and there's so many front lines in a way. So here's a question from Ian Bond, who is asking, he says, I don't think Russia will get out of Donbas willingly, but if they did, how would Ukraine handle it economically? So it's to Vlad, who pointed about the aging population and economy dependent on the coal mining doesn't make it sound like very easy area to integrate economically back into Ukraine, even if the infrastructure hasn't been ruined over the last 7 years. Vlad, how do you evaluate prospects of such eventual reintegration when it happens?
Yeah, you would expect of course the Ukrainian government to at that point to say that we need international financial donors. And we need to have a massive support package to rebuild, maybe from Germany, maybe from European Union itself, maybe from US, maybe from the UN of some kind. A lot of people who are in the occupied territories on the Donbas, they feel that they've been abandoned and that nobody will ever rebuild what is there been destroyed. So the expectations on the ground in the occupied territories, but also on the Ukrainian side of the Donbas, is that nobody really is going to rebuild it. People will just abandon it as it is, and it will be just left to rot. That is the perception on the ground. How that perception is real, and whether there will be a package of several, we're talking about what? We're talking about 20 billion of direct losses, 90 billion of indirect losses, plus human losses. We're talking about an enormous amount of money that Ukraine obviously doesn't have. Whether the international community and the donors are going to fork out hundreds of billions for the rebuilding of the Donbas, I don't think that is very realistic.
Right. I'd like to take one more question, and this one is coming from Ukraine, from Vitaly Sizov, who is also from, I believe he's from Donetsk himself, working in the media and Donbas Information Center. He's asking, that Zelenskyy still managed to make some improvements on the humanitarian side to reach out to the populations in the temporarily occupied territories. But he believes that there's more opportunity in this regards, and can Ukrainian authorities be more flexible in this humanitarian sphere, taking small steps to improve lives of the local population if the war cannot be stopped immediately as it looks? And what can be done to stop massive passportization of Donbas by Russia? Maybe Vlad, take this one.
Yes. If you remember 2014-15, the line on the sort of in the occupied Donetsk was that they were supposed to be running as good an economy as it used to be, and supposed to be a success story, and it will be better than the Ukraine itself. And that is why we had a lot of data back then in 14, 15, and 16, both on Donetsk and Luhansk, on salaries, on output, on tons of coal being produced as a sort of, whether it was propaganda or not, we don't know, but there was a lot of attempts by the self-proclaimed authorities to showcase the economic sort of recovery. From about December 16, that was all stopped. Mm-hmm. So neither Donetsk nor Luhansk so-called statistical agencies produce anything meaningful for us to understand what's going on. What we now have is that the average salaries, average pensions have dropped, or they've been kept frozen effectively whilst Ukrainians were growing, and now the gap in incomes has been growing as well. So I presume this is the moment when Ukraine can start to sort of flex its muscle in a way that it has now a more appealing proposition, definitely more appealing than occupied territories in terms of your health and well-being, but it's more appealing even in monetary terms. So Ukraine might start to reuse that initiative and regain the initiative by showing its generous heart. Yes.
Right. And I think since we only have 5 minutes left, and I could find no better question in the way of wrapping up this discussion as to ask a question sent to us by James Sher, our colleague in Tallinn. And I would like to ask all of you to answer this question. And the question is the following: what would Ukraine and the West have to do in concert and unison to persuade Russia that its goals, which have not changed since 2014, are simply not achievable? Who would like to take on this one first? Maybe Andriy.
Yeah, we can. First of all, obviously, it's a keep on pressure on delivering Minsk. That's sort of the simplest and the most straightforward answer. Minsk, apart from this sort of gray area regarding the consequence of the points, you know, of the sequence of the points regarding what comes first, security or elections. The rest of the Minsk agreement has quite a lot of good points about, like, disarmament of these formations and leaving the international and the foreign troops, which are Russian troops. Anyway, so delivering Minsk would be good, something to kind of to put a coherent pressure on Russia and keep the sanctions, and basically like stop taking the phrase "we are not there" as the answer, because every single government knows that they are there. I asked every single minister of defense who I met, and I met pretty much all of NATO ministers of defense, do you need any more proof? And nobody said they need more proof. So everybody was like absolutely comfortable with the position that yes, there are Russian regular forces there. And when they meet Russian government or president, you know, and he's saying we're not there, they kind of take it as some sort of, okay, let's move to the next question, you know. So, I mean, it's time to actually stop like being fed with that and actually take it lightly, you know. So that's what I would say.
Okay, Vlad?
Yes, I think the current, well, we mentioned COVID-19 pandemic. We mentioned also the oil prices going down to $20 on a very long-term basis now. I think there's a lot of lots of pressure on the financial fiscal side that the Russian government faces now, and spending $2, $3, maybe $5 billion a year on something that in long term might not be a good bet. That is something that surely the Russian regime calculates every day, and they totally understand the cost of running these protectorates in the two regions. So increasing the pressure, maintaining a long-term perspective to make the burden unbearable in the long term. Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul?
I think what's important is for the West to show that it's unified and that it's in it for the long haul. And ironically, and perhaps unfortunately, this puts in the most powerful position some of the governments within the European Union that have been the most waffleish. You think about the Italian government or the British Labour Party. When those parties say, look, we're on your side, or whatever, we're sympathetic, but we're not willing to go that far, then potentially Russia gives up the idea that it's going to split the West, get the sanctions undone, get the West to throw Ukraine under the bus in order to cut a deal with Russia. So I think doing those, showing unity and stickiness, and even sending some forward-looking signals that say, when the time comes, we're not going to let you get away with cutting the gas off to Ukraine just because we can get our gas from Nord Stream 2 now, will be really important.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think it looks like Ukraine has to persevere regardless. Of course, it would be better if it's all in the unison, and in a way Russia could never win this battle with the united West standing strongly with the democratic Ukraine. Ukraine still has a lot in terms of domestically to build its own resilience against Russian disinformation, against, you know, the dirty politics, the corrupt cash in the system, the, you know, still unreformed armed forces. There's still a long list to do for Ukraine, and perhaps, you know, we could move into another discussion of how Ukraine can build its own resilience. But I think it's been an excellent conversation today that combined both, you know, very strong academic research thinking with a very practical hands on the ground understanding of what it takes to defend Ukraine. And, you know, it looked like Russia has damaged but not defeated Ukraine on one hand. On the other, sanctions and Western assistance has damaged but not defeated Russia. So we will be in this for a long time. Politically, as Andriy knows, it's very difficult to do nothing. And it matters a lot for what kind of narrative there is about the conflict. And hopefully, you know, Ukrainians overall are hopeful. As I said in the beginning, even people living so close to the conflict believe Zelenskyy can somehow deliver. And I think if Ukraine sticks with its Western allies, it will be able to persevere. So I would like to thank all the speakers for joining us. Thank you all the participants. We've had over 100 of you joining. Apologies for those who I could not ask the question. We promise that we'll continue watching this, and stay connected with Chatham House, stay well, and have a nice rest of your days or evenings wherever you are. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks.
Cheers.